The grand ballroom of Atherton House was a galaxy of man-made stars. Diamonds glittered from throats and wrists, catching the light of 1,000 candles that hung in crystal constellations from the frescoed ceiling. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and hothouse flowers, vibrated with the drone of polite conversation and the soaring notes of the string quartet. For most of the ton, it was the pinnacle of the season, a night of possibility and promise. For Lady Eleanor Ainsworth, it was an exercise in endurance. For the 6th year in a row, she sat alone. She occupied a small gilt-wood chair in the shadow of a potted palm, a position she had perfected over time. It was neither so prominent as to invite pitying glances, nor so remote as to seem a deliberate snub to her hostess. It was a space of polite invisibility, a state she had come to inhabit as a second skin. Her gown, a deep amethyst silk, had been her one indulgence this year, purchased with coin she should have set aside for resoling her son's shoes. But for Thomas, her darling 6-year-old, she had to try. She had to believe that one of these nights, one of these glittering, heartless arenas, might yield a future for him that was more than genteel poverty on the fringes of society. Her husband, Captain James Ainsworth, had been a hero. He had died bravely for king and country, leaving her with a commendation from the crown, a small and rapidly dwindling pension, and a son with his father's kind eyes. He had also left her in an impossible social position. As the widow of a junior officer with no title and less fortune, she was a ghost at the feast, too well born to be a governess, too poor to be a viable match. The other mothers, the ones with plump daughters and ambitious eyes, saw her as a cautionary tale. The men, when they saw her at all, saw a woman whose circumstances were tragically inconvenient. So she sat, her gloved hands clasped loosely in her lap, a serene and pleasant expression fixed on her face. Inside, a quiet ache had settled permanently in her chest. She watched the dancers twirl under the chandeliers, a kaleidoscope of vibrant silks and crisp black wool. She saw Lady Beatrice Croft, a diamond of the first water, holding court near the refreshment table, her laughter as sharp and bright as the jewels at her throat. Beatrice had made it her personal mission to remind Eleanor of her place, her barbs always delivered with a devastatingly sweet smile. "Eleanor, darling," she'd trilled earlier, her voice carrying, "how brave of you to come. I do so admire your persistence." Eleanor had simply inclined her head, the practiced smile not wavering. To show a wound was to invite the wolves to tear it wider. She had learned that lesson 6 years ago, in the raw, bewildering days of her widowhood. Her gaze drifted from the dancers to the grand archway. A subtle shift rippled through the room, a change in atmospheric pressure. Conversations faltered. Fans fluttered a little faster. The Duke of Blackwood had arrived. Alistair Beaumont, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, was more myth than man. Impossibly wealthy, impossibly handsome, and impossibly cold. He was a figure carved from winter itself. Since the tragic death of his wife 3 years prior, he had attended only the most necessary of social engagements, and when he did, he moved through them like a spectre, his presence casting a chilling pall. They called him the Winter Duke, and it was a name well earned. His black evening clothes seemed to absorb the light around him, and his face, a study in aristocratic angles and shadows, was devoid of all expression. He stood for a moment, his silver-grey eyes scanning the room with an unnerving stillness. They held no warmth, No interest, only a profound and impenetrable emptiness. Every debutante in the room held her breath. Every ambitious mother sharpened her focus. The Duke was the prize of all prizes, and though he had shown no inclination to remarry, hope, in the London season, was a stubborn and hardy weed. Eleanor watched him with a distant, academic curiosity. He was like a creature from another world, a world of power and privilege she could barely imagine. His grief was a fortress, his fortune a kingdom. Her own struggles felt small and pathetic by comparison. She lowered her gaze to her lap, tracing the pattern of the lace on her gloves. It was foolish to stare. The music swelled, transitioning from a waltz to a quadrille. The polite hum of the room returned, albeit with a new, thrumming undercurrent of awareness. The Duke was here. Eleanor prepared to continue her vigil, to count the minutes until she could slip away without notice, her duty to be seen having been performed. That was when the world tilted on its axis. A pair of gleaming black boots stopped before her. Eleanor's gaze travelled slowly upwards, over the impeccable cut of a dark wool coat, a stark white cravat, and a jawline that looked as if it had been hewn from granite. She met the silver eyes of the Duke of Blackwood. The silence around them was absolute. The potted palm no longer offered any concealment. She felt as if she were standing alone on a vast, illuminated stage. 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on them. She could feel Lady Beatrice's stare like a physical blow. "Lady Ainsworth," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as cold and clear as a winter stream. It was not a question. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She forced herself to breathe, to remember her poise. "Your Grace," she murmured, inclining her head. It was the most she could manage. He did not offer a pleasantry. He did not smile. He simply extended a gloved hand. "Dance with me." It was not a request. It was a command, spoken with the quiet, unassailable authority of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. For a dizzying moment, Eleanor thought she might faint. The room swam. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. He must have mistaken her for someone else, someone important, someone who mattered. But his eyes, intense and unwavering, were fixed on her. He was waiting. To refuse a duke was a social death sentence. To accept was unthinkable, terrifying. Slowly, as if moving through water, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, cool, and impersonal. He led her onto the floor, the crowd parting before them as if by magic. The whispers followed them, a rustling, sibilant tide. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his cravat, unable to look at the sea of astonished faces, unable to meet his chilling gaze. The orchestra, after a moment's hesitation, began a waltz. He drew her into the frame of the dance, his hand a cool, formal pressure on the small of her back. They began to move, two solitary figures in the center of a swirling vortex of gossip and speculation. He was a masterful dancer, guiding her with effortless precision. Yet there was no joy in it, no connection. It was a mechanical, flawless execution of steps. His body was close, but his presence was 1,000 miles away. "You seem surprised, Lady Ainsworth," he said, after a long, agonizing silence. His voice was low, for her ears alone. "I am, Your Grace," she admitted, her own voice a mere thread of sound. "I am not accustomed to such an honor." "I do not deal in honors," he stated flatly. "I deal in necessities." She did not know how to respond to that. What necessity could he possibly have of her? A poor widow who was little more than a piece of scenery at these functions. They completed another turn, the candlelight glinting off the jet buttons of his coat. "You have a son," he said. It was not a question. The mention of Thomas sent a jolt of alarm through her. "Yes, Your Grace. Thomas. He is 6. "You have been a widow for 6 years," he continued, his tone unchanging. "You have not sought another match." Eleanor's spine stiffened. Was this an interrogation? "My circumstances have not been conducive to such pursuits, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, his gaze sweeping over her gown, his expression unreadable. "I imagine they have not." The music began to draw to a close. Panic fluttered in Eleanor's throat. She had survived. She had danced with the Winter Duke and had not shattered. Soon it would be over. She could retreat back to her palm tree, back to her invisibility. As he led her from the floor, however, he did not return her to her seat. He guided her toward the French doors that led to the terrace, his hand still firm at her back. The night air was cool, a welcome relief after the stifling heat of the ballroom. The terrace was deserted, the sounds of the party muted behind the heavy glass. He released her and turned to face her, his form a dark silhouette against the moonlit garden. "I have a proposal for you, Lady Ainsworth," he said, dispensing with any preamble. "It is not one of sentiment, but of pragmatism." Eleanor stared at him, bewildered. "A proposal?" "I require a wife," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I have a daughter. She needs a mother. My household requires a duchess to manage it. My station requires a partner to stand beside me at public functions. You are a lady of good breeding, impeccable character, and you are available. You are also, I have observed, resilient." Each word was a cold, smooth stone dropped into the silent well of her shock. He spoke of marriage as one might speak of hiring a new steward. "You, in turn," he continued, his gaze piercing the darkness, "require security, a future for your son, an end to this humiliating existence of sitting in corners, hoping not to be noticed. I'm offering you that security." Humiliating existence. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow because they were true. He had seen it. He had seen right through her carefully constructed facade of serenity. For the first time, a spark of anger pierced her fear. "And what do you offer in return for this position, Your Grace?" she asked, a sliver of ice in her own tone. "The title of Duchess of Blackwood," he said simply. "A home for you and your son. Wealth beyond your imagining. Complete financial security for the rest of your lives. He will be educated at Eton and Oxford and will want for nothing. You will want for nothing. Materially." He stressed the last word, and a chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept over her skin. "The terms are these," he went on, his voice dropping even lower. "This will be a marriage in name only. We will occupy separate wings of the house. We will present a united front to the world, but in private we will lead separate lives. There will be no expectations of affection, no demands on my time or my person beyond what is necessary for public appearances. I am not capable of providing the companionship or sentiment that a wife might ordinarily expect. My heart is not a part of this transaction. It is not available." He paused, letting the brutal finality of his terms settle in the space between them. "I will be a guardian to your son, a provider, and you will be a mother to my daughter, a duchess to my estate. It is a contract, nothing more." Eleanor felt the world contract to the space of the stone terrace. the Duke, the ballroom, the 6 years of loneliness. Her love for Thomas, a fierce, protective fire in her soul. He was offering her son a future she could only dream of, at the cost of her own heart, her own hope for a future that might contain love. But what hope was that, really? A girlish fantasy that had long since withered on the vine. She thought of Thomas's worn shoes. She thought of the condescending pity in Lady Beatrice's eyes. She thought of the endless nights spent worrying about their future, the gnawing anxiety that was her constant companion. He was offering her an escape, a gilded cage perhaps, but one where her son would be safe and provided for. And her, she had been alone for 6 years. The Duke was merely proposing to make the arrangement a permanent and comfortable one. "Why me?" she finally whispered, the question a fragile thing in the cold night air. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second. "Because you, Lady Ainsworth, do not look at me with foolish romantic notions. You look at me as if you too understand loss. You will not expect what I cannot give." It was the most devastatingly perceptive thing anyone had ever said to her. He had not chosen her for her beauty or her charm, but for the sadness he saw in her eyes. He had chosen her for her scars. She took a deep breath, the cool air steadying her. She looked past him at the distant, indifferent stars. She had sat alone at every ball for 6 years. Tonight, the most desired man in England had asked her to dance, only to offer her a lifetime of loneliness at his side, and for her son she would accept. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "I accept your proposal." The Duke of Blackwood gave a single sharp nod. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, only the dispassionate finality of a business deal concluded. "The arrangements will be made," he said. "My solicitor will call on you tomorrow." He turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving her alone on the terrace, with the ruins of her life and the blueprint of her future. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden, violent shiver racking her body. The music drifted out from the ballroom, a joyful, carefree waltz that sounded, to her ears, like a funeral dirge. She had just sold her future, and she could not even be certain she had gotten a good price. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a fog of surreal detachment. The Duke's solicitor, a dry and efficient man named Mr. Abernathy, had handled everything with unnerving speed. A special license was procured. A quiet ceremony was held in a dusty London church, attended only by Mr. Abernathy and Eleanor's bewildered, distant cousin, who acted as her witness. The Duke stood beside her, his face impassive, his vows spoken in that same flat, emotionless tone he had used on the terrace. He placed a heavy, ornate ring on her finger, its diamonds cold against her skin. And just like that, Lady Eleanor Ainsworth, the invisible widow, ceased to exist. In her place stood Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. The Duke's travelling carriage was as sombre and luxurious as the man himself. Upholstered in dark grey velvet, it was sprung so perfectly that the journey felt less like travelling over a road and more like floating. Thomas, her sweet Thomas, was beside her, his nose pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He had been quiet ever since Eleanor had explained their new life, his small hand frequently seeking hers for reassurance. Eleanor herself felt numb. She had packed her few belongings and Thomas's small trunk, a pathetic collection that seemed to shrink in the vast, echoing space of the Duke's London townhouse before being whisked away by footmen. The Duke had not travelled with them. He had left a day earlier, a note delivered by his secretary informing her that he would meet them upon their arrival at the estate. It was, she knew, the first manifestation of their agreement, separate lives. As the carriage turned off the main road and onto a long, winding drive, the landscape began to change. The gentle fields of the south gave way to a wilder, more dramatic beauty. Ancient oaks, their branches gnarled like old men's hands, lined the drive, forming a dense canopy that dappled the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air grew cooler, scented with damp earth and pine. And then she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house, it was a statement. A vast Gothic pile of grey stone that seemed to rise from the earth itself, all sharp angles, imposing towers, and dark, mullioned windows that looked like vacant eyes. It was magnificent, intimidating, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a perfect reflection of its master. A fine, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, slicking the stone to a dark, forbidding slate and blurring the edges of the world into a wash of grey. The weather, it seemed, was in accord with her own heart. The carriage rolled to a stop on a wide gravel courtyard. Before the footman could even open the door, the great oak doors of the manor swung inward. A line of servants stood assembled in the grand entrance hall, a silent black and white army awaiting inspection. At their head stood a tall, severe-looking woman in a crisp black dress, her grey hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun. As Eleanor descended from the carriage, holding tightly to Thomas's hand, the woman stepped forward and executed a perfect, stiff curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as starched as her apron. "Welcome to Blackwood. I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. We are all at your service." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor replied, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows and echoes. A soaring, vaulted ceiling was lost in the gloom far above. A massive stone fireplace, large enough to roast an ox, stood cold and empty. Suits of armor stood sentinel in shadowed alcoves, their metal visors seeming to watch her with silent judgment. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint, funereal scent of beeswax and thyme. And there, standing at the top of a sweeping, bifurcated staircase, was the Duke. He was dressed not in formal wear, but in simple, dark riding clothes that somehow made him seem even more formidable. He did not come down to greet them. He simply watched, his expression as remote and unreadable as ever. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "show the Duchess to the Sutherland wing, and the boy to his rooms." The Sutherland wing, not her wing. The name itself was a reinforcement of the distance, the separation, and the boy, not her son. Eleanor's hand tightened on Thomas's. "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said. She turned to Eleanor. "If you and the young master will follow me." Eleanor looked up at her new husband, a silent plea in her eyes. Could he not offer a single word of welcome, a small gesture of kindness for her son? He met her gaze, his own eyes like chips of granite. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. This was the reality of their bargain. There would be no comfort from him. With a heavy heart, she followed Mrs. Gable up the grand staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing on the marble. The Duke remained where he was, a silent, brooding statue, watching them go. The Sutherland wing was as opulent as it was lonely. A spacious sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold, a bedroom with a canopied bed large enough for a family of 4, a dressing room lined with empty wardrobes. The fires were lit, casting a warm glow on the polished furniture and silk wallpaper, but it was an impersonal warmth, a duty performed by servants, not a sign of welcome. Thomas's rooms were adjoining, equally fine, and filled with beautiful, brand-new toys that he regarded with suspicion rather than delight. After a footman had brought a tray of tea and sandwiches, which neither of them touched, Eleanor sat with Thomas on the window seat overlooking the vast, manicured lawns. The rain had intensified, streaking down the leaded glass panes like tears. "Mamma," Thomas whispered, his small voice trembling slightly. "Is this our home now?" Eleanor pulled him close, stroking his soft brown hair. "Yes, darling, it is. I don't like it," he said. "It's too big, and the gentleman is very tall. The gentleman, her husband, the Duke. He is the Duke, Thomas. We must be very polite to him. Does he not like us?" The innocent question was a dagger in Eleanor's heart. "He is not used to having children around, my love. We must give him time." She was lying, of course. Time would not change the terms of their contract. That evening, she dined alone with Thomas in her private sitting room. The Duke, a servant informed her, was taking his meal in his study. Another wall, another boundary. After putting a weary Thomas to bed, Eleanor paced the confines of her gilded cage. She felt a desperate, suffocating loneliness. She had exchanged one form of isolation for another, far grander one. The next day, she resolved to take some measure of control. She was the Duchess of this house, whether she felt like it or not. After breakfast, she requested to see Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper appeared, her expression one of neutral efficiency. "Mrs. Gable, I should like to see the rest of the house," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "And I should like to be introduced to the staff." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed over the housekeeper's stern features. "Of course, Your Grace, as you wish." The tour took hours. Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth of drawing rooms, ballrooms, libraries, and endless corridors lined with the portraits of stern-faced Beaumont ancestors. The staff, from the butler down to the youngest scullery maid, were uniformly respectful and utterly remote. They moved with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency, their faces blank masks. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath. Finally, Eleanor asked the question that had been hovering at the edge of her thoughts since her arrival. "And the Duke's daughter?" she asked, her voice softer. "I should very much like to meet her." Mrs. Gable's lips thinned. "Miss Lily is in the nursery, Your Grace, in the West Wing." The West Wing. His wing. "Please take me to her." The nursery was a large, airy room at the top of the house. It was filled with every imaginable toy a child could desire. A magnificent dollhouse, a rocking horse with a real horsehair mane, shelves of brightly colored books. But like the rest of the manor, it was unnervingly silent. In the center of the room, sitting on the floor with a porcelain doll in her lap, was a small, elfin child. She had a cloud of pale blonde hair and eyes the same startling silver grey as her father's. She could not have been more than 5 years old. She did not look up when they entered. A governess, a young woman with anxious eyes, rose and curtsied. "This is Miss Finch, Miss Lily's governess," Mrs. Gable announced. Eleanor ignored the governess for a moment, her gaze fixed on the little girl. She knelt down, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hello, Lily," she said softly. "My name is Eleanor. It's a pleasure to meet you." The child did not respond. She did not even blink. She continued to stare at the doll in her lap, her small face a perfect porcelain mask of indifference. "She does not speak much, Your Grace," Miss Finch stammered. Not for a long time." Eleanor's heart went out to the lonely little girl. She saw a reflection of her own isolation in those still, silent features. She was another prisoner in this cold, magnificent house. "May I?" Eleanor asked, gesturing to the floor beside Lily. Miss Finch nodded, looking terrified. Eleanor sat, tucking her skirts around her. She didn't try to talk to Lily again. She simply sat there, in the silence, for a very long time. This, she thought, was her true purpose here. Not to manage the household or host parties, but to reach this lost little girl. Her resolve was tested a few days later by the arrival of an unannounced visitor. Eleanor was in the morning room, trying to make sense of the household accounts, when the butler announced, with a hint of trepidation, "Lady Beatrice Croft." Eleanor's heart sank. Beatrice swept into the room like a bird of prey, all vibrant color and sharp, predatory smiles. She was dressed in a fashionable riding habit, a plume of peacock feathers jaunty in her hat. "Eleanor, or should I say, Your Grace," she purred, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, judging. "I was just riding by and simply had to stop in and see how you are settling." What a remarkable turn of events. Who would have thought it? The insinuation was clear. Who would have thought that you, the poor brown mouse, would land the Duke? "Beatrice," Eleanor said, her voice even. "How kind of you to call." "Oh, it's no kindness. It's pure fascination," Beatrice said, settling herself uninvited on the sofa. "The whole of London is agog. You must tell me everything. Is he as formidable as they say? I confess, I always found his brooding intensity rather thrilling." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "But a bit of a challenge in a husband, I should imagine. Does he even speak?" "The Duke is a very private man," Eleanor said, her back straight. "As I am sure you are aware." Beatrice's smile tightened. "Of course. And this house, it's a mausoleum, isn't it? Poor Isabella, his first wife, you know. Such a tragic creature. So delicate. She simply withered away in this place. Hated it, apparently. I do hope you are made of sterner stuff, darling." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to wound, to undermine, to make Eleanor feel like an imposter. And it was working. The mention of the first Duchess, Isabella, sent a chill through her. She was a ghost who still haunted these halls, a standard against which Eleanor would undoubtedly be measured and found wanting. "I am sure I will manage," Eleanor said, her voice cooler than she intended. "Well," Beatrice said, rising gracefully, "I won't keep you. I can see you are busy, playing at being Duchess. Do try not to break anything too valuable." She paused at the door, her eyes glittering with malice. "And do give my best to Alistair. We were very close before you so unexpectedly appeared on the scene." She swept out, leaving the scent of her expensive perfume and her toxic insinuations lingering in the air. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. This was her new life. A cold husband, a silent stepdaughter, a house full of ghosts, and a society full of vipers, like Beatrice Croft. For a moment, despair washed over her, so potent it threatened to drown her. Then she thought of Thomas, his trusting face, and the small, silent girl in the nursery. No, she would not be broken. She would not wither away, like the delicate Isabella. Beatrice had been right about one thing. Eleanor was made of sterner stuff. She had survived 6 years of widowhood and poverty. She would survive this. She would not just endure. She would find a way to build a life here, even if it was not the one she had ever imagined. She would find a way to make this cold, grey stone house a home. The days that followed settled into a quiet, monotonous rhythm. Eleanor was the Duchess of Blackwood, and yet her life was circumscribed by invisible walls. She took her meals with Thomas in her wing. The Duke took his in his. They were two ships passing in the night, their paths crossing only occasionally in the long, echoing corridors. On these occasions he would give her a curt, formal nod, his eyes looking straight through her, and continue on his way. He never asked about her day, never mentioned his own. He was a constant, remote presence, the source of all her comfort and all her misery. Eleanor, however, refused to retreat. She had made a bargain, and part of that bargain was to be a mother to his daughter. She made a point of visiting the nursery every day, at the same time. At first, her presence was met with the same unnerving silence. Lily would not look at her, would not acknowledge her. Miss Finch, the governess, would hover nervously, wringing her hands. Instead of forcing interaction, Eleanor simply coexisted. She would bring a book and read quietly in a chair by the window. Sometimes she would bring her needlework. She spoke to Lily in a low, gentle voice, not asking questions that required an answer, but simply narrating her own actions. "I think I shall sit here by the fire. It's a bit chilly today." Or, "Listen, can you hear the blackbirds singing outside?" One afternoon, she brought Thomas with her. He was hesitant at first, intimidated by Lily's silence, but he was a child, and his world was simpler. He had brought a set of carved wooden animals. He sat on the floor a few feet from Lily and began to arrange them in a line. A cow, a sheep, a pig, a horse. "This is Noah's Ark," he announced to the room at large. "They are going for a walk." He moved the animals one by one. Lily, for the first time, turned her head. Her grey eyes, so like her father's, watched the small wooden procession. She did not speak, but she watched. It was the first crack in the ice. From then on, Thomas became her co-conspirator. He would bring his toys to the nursery, his quiet, gentle play a stark contrast to the room's oppressive stillness. He didn't demand a response from Lily. He simply included her in his world. He would talk to her, telling her stories about the wooden animals, asking her opinion on where the toy soldiers should march. And slowly, infinitesimally, Lily began to respond. A flicker of her eyes, a tiny inclination of her head. Eleanor, meanwhile, had found a project of her own. Beyond the manicured lawns that surrounded the front of the manor, at the back of the house, she discovered a vast, walled garden that had been left to ruin. A magnificent glass conservatory, its panes clouded with grime and choked with ivy, stood at its center like a forgotten cathedral. The flower beds were a riot of weeds, the paths were obscured by overgrown bushes, and a stone fountain was green with moss, its cherubic centerpiece lying broken on the ground. It was a place of profound neglect, a mirror of the emotional state of the house and its inhabitants, and Eleanor felt an immediate, inexplicable pull toward it. This, she thought, was a place she could heal. She sought out the head gardener, a grizzled, taciturn man named Mr. Croft, no relation, she prayed, to Beatrice. He was skeptical when she announced her intention to restore the garden. "Hasn't been touched since the first Duchess passed, Your Grace," he grumbled, pulling at his cap. "The Duke, he don't like no one going in there." "The Duke has given me his permission," Eleanor said, a small white lie she hoped would be forgiven. She would ask for his permission, of course. Forgiveness, she had learned, was often easier to obtain than permission. That evening, she braced herself and sought out her husband. She found him in the main library, a vast two-story room lined with thousands of leather-bound books. He was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, a single lamp casting his face in sharp relief, making him look like one of the stern-faced ancestors in the portraits. "Your Grace," she began, her voice sounding small in the immense room. He looked up, his expression one of faint annoyance at being disturbed. "I have a request," she said, ploughing ahead before she lost her nerve. "The walled garden at the back of the estate. It is in a state of disrepair. I should like to work on it, to bring it back to life." He stared at her for a long moment, his silver eyes narrowed. She expected a refusal, a cold dismissal of her whim. She had trespassed on territory that was clearly linked to his past, to his late wife. "Do as you wish," he said finally, his voice flat. He looked back down at the papers on his desk, the audience clearly over. Eleanor stood there for a moment, stunned. It was not an enthusiastic endorsement, but it was not a no. It was assent, however indifferent. It was enough. The next morning she put on a sturdy pair of gloves she found in the potting shed, and a plain, old dress. She enlisted Thomas, who was thrilled at the prospect of getting dirty. They went to the walled garden. Eleanor started with the conservatory, battling the ivy that clung to the glass, while Thomas set about clearing a small patch of weeds with a trowel. It was hard, physical work, and by the end of the day, Eleanor's muscles ached and her hands were scratched. But she felt a sense of satisfaction, of purpose that she had not felt since her arrival. Here, in this neglected space, she was not the Duchess. She was just Eleanor, a woman tending a garden. A few days into her project, something remarkable happened. As she and Thomas were working, the nursery door to the garden, a small oak door set into the wall, creaked open. Lily stood there, holding Miss Finch's hand. She watched them for a long time, her small face impassive. "Would you like to help?" Thomas called out, holding up a bright red primrose he had just unearthed from a tangle of weeds. Lily looked from Thomas to Eleanor, then back again. Slowly, she let go of Miss Finch's hand and took a tentative step onto the overgrown path. She walked over to Thomas and pointed a small, delicate finger at the flower. "What's that?" she whispered, her voice a tiny, rusty thing, as if it hadn't been used in years. Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely, not wanting to frighten the girl. Thomas, bless his innocent heart, simply smiled. "It's a flower," he said. "It's pretty, isn't it?" Lily nodded, and then, without another word, she knelt beside him and began to pull at a small weed with her tiny fingers. It was the beginning. From that day on, the garden became their sanctuary. Every afternoon, the three of them would work there. Eleanor taught them the names of the plants they uncovered, the difference between a weed and a flower. She told them stories of the sleeping princess who lived in the broken fountain, waiting for the garden to be beautiful again, to wake up. Lily rarely spoke, but she listened. And she worked, with a quiet determination that was a miniature echo of her father's intensity. She began to look less like a porcelain doll and more like a real child, with dirt on her knees and a smudge of earth on her cheek. A faint hint of colour returned to her pale face. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was doing the right thing. She was not just restoring a garden, she was coaxing two small, damaged children back into the sun. She was aware, too, of being watched. Sometimes she would look up at the house and see a flicker of movement at the window of the Duke's study, which overlooked the garden. He never came down. He never said a word. But he was watching. One evening, as she was coming in from the garden, her hands earthy and her hair damp with mist, she almost collided with him in the corridor. He was standing there, blocking her path, his tall frame filling the narrow space. "Your Grace," she murmured, startled, instinctively trying to hide her dirt-stained hands behind her back. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to her hands, then back to her face. She braced herself for a reprimand, for a comment on her un-duchess-like appearance. "There is a crate in the main hall," he said, his voice clipped. "From London. The contents are for the garden." Before she could respond, he turned and strode away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Confused, Eleanor went to the main hall. There, sitting in the middle of the vast, polished floor, was a large wooden crate. With the help of a curious footman, she pried it open. Inside, nestled in straw, were 3 small sets of gardening tools, trowels, forks, and gloves, all perfectly sized for children, and beneath them, carefully wrapped in damp hessian, were the roots of a dozen exquisite rose bushes, their labels bearing names like Souvenir de la Malmaison and Gloire de Dijon. There was no note, no explanation, but there didn't need to be. Eleanor stood there in the cold, echoing hall and touched a delicate, dormant rose cane. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her dusty cheek. The Winter Duke had bought her flowers. It was not a bouquet, not a romantic gesture. It was a practical, unspoken acknowledgement, a contribution. It was the first glimmer of warmth, as faint and as precious as the first crocus of spring pushing its way through the frozen earth. He saw her. He saw what she was doing, and in his own cold, silent way, he had approved. The arrival of the roses marked a subtle but significant shift in the climate of Blackwood Manor. It was as if a frost that had held the house in its grip for years had begun, ever so slightly, to thaw. The Duke remained as distant as ever in his person, but his actions, however small, spoke of a new awareness. He no longer looked through Eleanor in the corridors. His gaze would now meet hers for a fraction of a second, a silent, unreadable acknowledgement. The children were the true barometers of the changing atmosphere. With the new tools, their work in the garden took on a new seriousness. Thomas, ever the little man, took charge of a small vegetable patch, while Lily, with a delicate, innate artistry, devoted herself to the rose bushes. She would talk to them, her whispers too soft for Eleanor to hear, as she carefully tended them. Her vocabulary was expanding, timidly at first, then with more confidence. She began to ask questions, her natural childhood curiosity, so long suppressed, finally breaking through. Eleanor found her own role solidifying. She was no longer just the woman who had married the Duke. She was the lady of the garden, the mother of the 2 children who were bringing it back to life. The staff, too, began to change their tune. Mrs. Gable's stern demeanor softened with a grudging respect. She started appearing with offerings of lemonade and biscuits for the young gardeners. And once, Eleanor overheard her scolding a footman for tracking mud onto the marble floors, only to add, "But it is good, honest dirt from the Duchess's garden." The Duke's contributions continued, always practical, always anonymous. A rare botanical encyclopedia appeared in the library, left open to a page on restoring formal gardens. A delivery of fine gravel arrived for the paths. He was like a ghost, his presence felt but never seen, participating in the garden's restoration from a distance. One late afternoon, Eleanor was in the conservatory, carefully cleaning the panes of an old stained glass panel depicting Saint Fiacre, the patron saint of gardeners, which she had discovered beneath a thick shroud of ivy. The setting sun slanted through the newly cleaned glass, casting a kaleidoscope of ruby and sapphire light across the stone floor. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear him enter. "It was my mother's," a low voice said from the doorway. Eleanor jumped, dropping her cloth. Alistair stood there, watching her. It was the first time he had ever sought her out, the first time he had entered the conservatory since she had begun her work. "Your Grace," she stammered, her heart beating a little too fast. "You startled me." He walked further into the room, his boots silent on the flagstones. He ran a gloved finger along the frame of the stained glass. She designed this conservatory. She loved this garden more than any other part of the estate. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. He was giving her a piece of his history, a small, precious shard. "It is a beautiful design," Eleanor said softly. "It deserves to be brought back to its former glory." He looked around the space. The ivy was gone. The glass was clean. The stone floor had been swept, and pots of geraniums and ferns she had salvaged were beginning to add splashes of color. "You have done a great deal of work." It was not praise, not exactly, but it was an observation, and from him it felt like a torrent of compliments. "The children have been a great help," she said, wanting to deflect the attention from herself. "I have noticed," he said. His gaze rested on the small, child-sized tools leaning against a bench. A strange, unreadable expression flickered in his eyes. Was it sadness? Regret? Before she could decipher it, it was gone, replaced by his usual cool mask. "Lily, she speaks more." "Yes," Eleanor said, a warm rush of pride filling her. "She has a great deal to say, once she feels safe enough to say it." The implication hung in the air between them. He was the one who had not made her feel safe. His coldness, his grief, had been a suffocating blanket over the entire house, and most especially over his own daughter. He seemed to feel the weight of her unspoken words. He turned his back to her, looking out over the garden where the last of the sun's rays were gilding the overgrown leaves. Her mother, Isabella, she did not care for gardening. She found the country suffocating. His voice was tight, strained. She was a creature of light and laughter, of ballrooms. This place, this quiet, it was a cage for her. Eleanor's throat tightened with a sudden, unexpected pang of sympathy for the ghost of the first Duchess, and for the man who had clearly loved her, and whose love had not been enough to save her from her own unhappiness. "I am sorry," Eleanor whispered. He gave a short, sharp shake of his head, as if to dismiss her sympathy. "It is in the past." He turned back to her, his face once again a cool, impenetrable facade. "The steward informs me that the annual Tenants' Harvest Festival is in 2 weeks. As Duchess, you will be expected to preside. He will provide you with the details." The sudden shift in topic was jarring, a deliberate slamming of a door he had, for a moment, cracked open. He was retreating back to the safety of their formal arrangement. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, her voice betraying none of her disappointment. He nodded once, then turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving Eleanor alone in the jewel-toned light of the conservatory, her mind reeling. He had shown her a glimpse of the man behind the mask, the grieving husband, the worried father. It was a fleeting, ephemeral moment, but it was more than she had ever hoped for. It was a glimmer of the man he might have been, the man he might still become. And it gave her hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, that this marriage of convenience might one day be something more. The news of Eleanor's quiet triumphs at Blackwood Manor, the partial restoration of the garden, the miraculous blossoming of the silent child, did not go unnoticed. Whispers, carried by servants and tradesmen, eventually found their way back to the drawing rooms of London. For some, it was a source of mild curiosity. For Lady Beatrice Croft, it was an intolerable affront. Beatrice had considered the Duke of Blackwood her own private territory. She had been patient, circling his grief like a patient vulture, waiting for the moment he would finally turn to her for comfort, for the continuation of his line. Eleanor's sudden marriage had been a shocking, infuriating disruption of her plans. She had assumed the provincial little widow would be unequal to the task, that she would quickly be crushed by the Duke's coldness and the oppressive gloom of the estate. But the reports suggested the opposite. The little mouse was not just surviving, she was, improbably, thriving. Beatrice decided it was time for a more direct intervention. She could not allow this upstart to solidify her position. An invitation arrived at Blackwood Manor, written in Beatrice's elegant, looping script. It was for a small, exclusive house party at her family's nearby estate. It was, she wrote, a chance to formally welcome the new Duchess to the county. The invitation was a command performance, a summons Eleanor could not refuse without causing a serious social breach. The Duke read the invitation over breakfast, a meal they had, in recent weeks, begun to take in the same room, though still at opposite ends of a very long table. His face gave away nothing. "You will have to go," he said, his voice flat. "I will not be attending. I have estate business." "And the children?" Eleanor asked, her heart sinking at the thought of leaving them. "They will remain here," he stated. It was not a discussion. Eleanor felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She would have to face Beatrice and her circle of gossips alone. She would be a specimen under a microscope, her every word, her every gesture scrutinized and judged. The day of the party arrived, grey and overcast. As Eleanor was preparing to leave, a footman appeared with a long, flat box. "From His Grace," the footman said. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a magnificent necklace of sapphires and diamonds. It was a famous piece, the Blackwood sapphires, a family heirloom worn by generations of duchesses. A small, stiff card was tucked inside. It read simply, "Wear these, B." It was the first time he had ever used his initial, the closest he had come to a personal signature. The necklace was heavy and cold against her skin. It was not a gift, it was armor. He was sending her into battle, and he was ensuring she was appropriately attired for her rank. The atmosphere at Lady Beatrice's home was one of cloying sweetness and barely concealed malice. Beatrice greeted her at the door, her smile as bright and false as a stage prop. "Eleanor, You came, and wearing the Blackwood sapphires. How appropriate. They do say they are cursed, you know, that they only bring happiness to a true love match. The first shot had been fired. Throughout the afternoon, Eleanor was subjected to a barrage of thinly veiled insults and prying questions, all orchestrated by Beatrice. "Tell me, Your Grace," one woman asked, her eyes sharp and curious. "Is it true the Duke has not opened the late Duchess's wing of the house? How romantic. He must still be so devoted to her memory." "The Duke's arrangements in his own home are his affair," Eleanor replied calmly, her voice even. "I am sure you understand." Later, another guest, a well-known gossip columnist named Mrs. Albright, cornered her by the fireplace. Beatrice had, of course, ensured Mrs. Albright was a guest. "Your Grace," the woman began, her pen practically twitching in her hand. "Yours is such a Cinderella story. A poor widow, swept off her feet by the most eligible bachelor in the kingdom. It must be a true love match." "My husband and I have a great deal of respect for one another," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. "And we are both devoted to our children." Beatrice, who had drifted over, let out a tinkling, malicious laugh. "Oh, Eleanor, you are so very diplomatic. But we are all friends here. You can admit it. You were in a desperate position. The Duke, in his grief, needed a mother for his child. It was a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience. No one would think less of you for it. In fact, we admire your pragmatism." The room went silent. Every eye was on Eleanor. Beatrice had laid the trap, and now she was closing it. To deny it would be to lie, and to be caught in that lie would be ruinous. To admit it would be to confirm her status as a hired functionary, a duchess in name only, stripping her of all authority and respect. Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her. She looked at the faces around her, hungry for scandal, for her humiliation. She was alone, undefended, and then the drawing-room doors opened. The Duke of Blackwood stood on the threshold. He was dressed in riding clothes, his boots dusty, his hair slightly dishevelled, as if he had ridden hard and fast. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. The air in the room crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. He ignored everyone else, his silver eyes locking on Eleanor. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He came to a stop beside her, his presence a solid, unshakable wall of power. "I apologize for my lateness," he said, his voice a low growl that carried to every corner of the room. He took Eleanor's hand, his grip firm and possessive, and raised it to his lips. "My wife and I were delayed." My wife. The words, spoken with such deliberate emphasis, echoed in the stunned silence. He had claimed her, publicly, unequivocally. He then turned his gaze, which had lost all its previous coolness and was now burning with a glacial fire, upon Beatrice. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "I find your concern for the nature of my marriage impertinent. My wife," he said the word again, a weapon this time, "is the Duchess of Blackwood. She is the mother of my child and the mistress of my home. Her character is beyond question, and her position is unassailable. Any insult to her or to her son is an insult to me, and I do not tolerate insults." Beatrice had gone deathly pale. The triumphant smirk had been wiped from her face, replaced by a mask of horrified shock. "Alistair, Your Grace, I meant no disrespect," she stammered. "Did you not?" the Duke asked, his voice dripping with ice. "It seems to me you have spent the afternoon attempting to humiliate the Duchess. This is not the behavior of a friend. It is the behavior of an enemy. And the enemies of my wife are my enemies." He let the statement hang in the air, a threat more potent than any physical violence. "I believe we will be taking our leave now. We will not be calling on you again." He turned his back on her, a dismissal so absolute it was like a physical blow. With his hand still firmly holding Eleanor's, he led her from the room. He did not look at anyone else. He did not have to. The message had been delivered. He swept her out of the house and into the waiting Blackwood carriage, which had apparently been following him. He bundled her inside and sat opposite her, the silence in the carriage thick with unspoken emotions. Eleanor stared at him, her heart hammering in her chest. He had ridden here. He had come for her. He had defended her. He had called her my wife, with a possessiveness that sent a shiver down her spine. "How did you know?" she finally whispered. "One of the stable boys at Beatrice's estate is the son of my head groom," he said curtly. "He is a loyal boy. Overheard the servants talking about Lady Beatrice's plans for your visit, and about the presence of the gossip columnist. He rode to Blackwood to warn me. So it was not magic. It was a network of loyalty he commanded. Still, he had come. He could have ignored the warning. He could have let her fend for herself. But he had not. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He just grunted in response, turning his head to look out the window, his jaw tight. The storm on his face had not yet broken. When they arrived back at Blackwood, he escorted her to the door of her wing. The formality, which had been so absolute between them, now seemed absurd. "Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time. He stopped, his back to her. He did not turn around. "What you did today," she began, then faltered. "Thank you." He stood there for a long moment. "She threatened my house," he said finally, his voice rough. "You are the Duchess. An attack on you is an attack on the stability I am trying to build for my daughter. It was a matter of necessity. A matter of necessity." He was retreating again, back behind his walls, trying to frame his passionate defense of her in the cold, practical language of their original agreement. But Eleanor was not fooled. She had seen the look in his eyes when he had walked into that drawing room. It had not been practical. It had been personal. He had defended his Duchess, yes, but he had also, she believed, defended Eleanor, and that realization was a far more precious jewel than the cold sapphires that still rested against her skin. They had faced a common enemy, and in doing so, had forged their first true alliance. They were, for the first time, a united front. The Duke and his Duchess, a husband and his wife. The aftermath of the confrontation at Lady Beatrice's was a profound and unsettling quiet. Beatrice and her family departed for the continent with unseemly haste, her social star extinguished as swiftly and completely as a snuffed candle. The Tun, ever fickle, now viewed the new Duchess of Blackwood not as a curiosity, but as a woman protected by the formidable power of her husband. Eleanor had won, but the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the raw, unvarnished emotion of the Duke's intervention. He had retreated further into himself since that day, his silence more profound, his presence more remote than ever. It was as if the effort of defending her had drained him of some vital energy, forcing him back behind even thicker walls. The fragile bridge of understanding they had begun to build in the garden conservatory seemed to have crumbled. Life continued. The garden thrived under the care of Eleanor and the children. Lily was now a chatterbox, her laughter a sound as bright and welcome as birdsong in the quiet halls. Thomas was happy and secure. By all outward measures, Eleanor's bargain had been a spectacular success, but a deep, aching loneliness persisted. She had a husband who was a stranger, a partner in name only, a man whose heart was a locked room to which she would never have the key. Then the storm came. It began not in the sky, but in Lily. She woke one morning with a flushed face and a cough that rattled her small frame. By afternoon, she was burning with fever. The local doctor, a kindly old man named Dr. Harris, was summoned. He clucked his tongue and spoke of a virulent ague that was sweeping the county. He prescribed broths, cool compresses, and bed rest, and left with a reassuring but non-committal promise to call again in the morning. But as night fell, the storm outside broke, a furious tempest of wind and rain that lashed against the windows of the manor, and the fever inside Lily climbed higher. Her breathing grew shallow and ragged. Miss Finch was beside herself with panic. Mrs. Gable's stern composure had cracked, her face etched with worry. Eleanor took charge. She sent a groom to ride through the storm to fetch Dr. Harris again, though she knew it was a perilous journey. She dismissed the weeping governess and sent for basins of cool water, fresh linens, and the herbal remedies she had learned from her own mother. She sat by Lily's bedside, bathing her forehead, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, willing her own strength into the child's feverish body. Alistair appeared in the doorway of the nursery like a wraith, his face a stark white mask of terror. He looked at his daughter, so small and frail in the big bed, and a tremor ran through his entire body. He was paralyzed, a statue of controlled panic. He had seen this before. A sick child, a looming tragedy. "What did the doctor say?" he asked, his voice a harsh, rasping whisper. "It is a fever," Eleanor said calmly, her focus never leaving the child. "We must keep it from climbing any higher." He did not move from the doorway. He could not seem to bring himself to enter the room, as if a force field of past trauma held him at bay. Eleanor understood. He was not seeing Lily in that bed. He was seeing Isabella, his first wife. He was seeing the beginning of the end. "Go to your study, Alistair," she said gently, but with a firm authority he had never heard from her before. "I will send for you if there is any change. You are no good to her like this." For a moment he looked as if he might argue, but then the fight seemed to go out of him. He nodded, a broken, jerky movement, and disappeared. The hours bled into one another. The storm outside raged. The clock in the hall chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. Eleanor did not leave the bedside. She worked tirelessly, her hands never still, her voice a constant, murmuring reassurance in the dark, sick room. Mrs. Gable came and went, bringing fresh water and whispered words of encouragement. Some time after 2, Alistair returned. He did not stand in the doorway this time. He came into the room and took the chair on the other side of the bed. He did not speak. He simply sat, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees, his eyes fixed on his daughter's face. They kept their vigil together, two silent figures united in their fear, the storm-tossed manor their ark. The air in the room was thick with the scent of fever and medicinal herbs, with the sound of Lily's ragged breathing and the relentless drumming of the rain. It was in this crucible of fear and exhaustion that Alistair finally broke. "The snow was falling," he said, his voice so low Eleanor had to strain to hear him over the storm. Just like this, a storm. Lily had a cold, nothing more, a child's sniffle. But Isabella, she could not bear to hear her cry. Eleanor stopped wringing out her cloth, her hands still in the cool water. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze on Lily, giving him the privacy of the darkness. "She suffered from a melancholy," he continued, his voice rough with unshed tears. "After Lily was born, the doctors had no name for it. They called it hysteria, nerves. They told her to be grateful for her blessings." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Blessings. She felt cursed. She believed she was a failure as a mother, a monster. She would look at Lily as if she were a stranger. He fell silent for a long time, the only sounds the storm and the ticking of the clock. That day, Lily was crying. Isabella came to me, her eyes wild. She said she couldn't do it anymore, that she was poisoning her own child with her sadness. I was impatient. I was worried about estate matters. I told her she was being foolish, that the child just had a cold. I told her to go and rest. He stopped. His voice choked. He took a shuddering breath and forced himself to go on. She went quiet then. She kissed my cheek and said she was going for a walk, to clear her head. It was snowing heavily, but she loved the snow. I let her go. I was relieved to have a moment of peace. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. An hour later, I went to find her. The snow had covered her tracks. I found her by the lake. She had simply lain down in the snow, as if she were going to sleep. The story fell into the quiet room, a terrible, heavy thing. It was not just grief he had been carrying, but guilt, a profound, soul-crushing guilt that he had failed her, that he had not seen the depth of her despair, that his last words to her had been impatient, dismissive. His coldness was not a failing, it was a penance. His emotional distance was not a choice, it was a prison he had built for himself, brick by brick. He had been terrified of loving Lily, terrified of that same helplessness, terrified that he would fail her too. He had married Eleanor as a practical solution, installing a competent, resilient woman to do the job he felt he was monstrously incapable of performing. Eleanor's heart broke, not just for him, but for the lonely, misunderstood Isabella, for the motherless child, and for the man who had been living in a frozen hell of his own making for 3 long years. She rose from her chair and went to him. She did not offer platitudes or easy comforts. She simply knelt on the floor beside his chair and, after a moment's hesitation, reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, as if burned, but he did not pull away. Through the rough fabric of his coat, she could feel the tremors that shook his body. She just held on, her small, steady hand a silent anchor in his storm. They stayed like that for a long time. 2 strangers bound by a contract, now bound by a shared vigil and a terrible, heartbreaking confession. Outside, the wind and rain began to subside, and inside, the small, feverish child in the bed, the battle for her life reached its turning point. As the first pale, watery light of dawn crept through the window, Lily's breathing deepened, and a faint sheen of sweat broke on her brow. The fever had broken. The dawn that followed the storm was quiet and clean, the world washed new. Lily slept, a deep, healing sleep, her breathing even, her skin cool to the touch. Dr. Harris arrived, looking haggard from his night's journey, and pronounced the crisis over. She would be weak for a few days, but she would recover. The relief that washed through the house was so profound it was almost a physical presence. Mrs. Gable was openly weeping with joy. Miss Finch was fluttering and fussing. But in the nursery, a different kind of quiet had settled between Eleanor and Alistair. The shared trauma of the night and his raw, devastating confession had irrevocably altered the landscape between them. The polite fiction of their arrangement had been stripped away, leaving something bare, vulnerable, and terrifyingly real. He had not left the room. After his confession, after the fever had broken, he had simply pulled his chair closer to the bed and watched his daughter sleep, his face a complex mask of relief, exhaustion, and a dawning, fragile hope. Eleanor had watched him, her heart aching with a tenderness that was so new and overwhelming it frightened her. She saw not the cold, intimidating Duke, but a man who had been drowning in silent grief and guilt, a father who loved his child so fiercely he had been terrified of that love. When the sun was fully risen, casting long golden shafts of light into the room, he finally looked at her. The exhaustion in his eyes was profound, but the icy shield was gone. For the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough. He stopped, as if he did not have the words. "Get some rest, Alistair," she said softly. "We are all safe now." He nodded, but he did not leave. Instead, his gaze fell to her hands, which were red and chapped from the hours of wringing out cool cloths. Without a word, he reached out and took her hand in his. His touch was not the cool, formal contact of the ballroom or the possessive grip of their public appearances. It was hesitant, gentle, a question. He turned her hand over, his thumb tracing the worn, reddened skin of her palm. It was the most intimate gesture that had ever passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of her labor, her care, her strength. He held her hand for a long moment, a lifeline in the quiet room, before releasing it with a sigh, and finally, leaving to get some rest. In the days that followed, the house slowly came back to life, but it was a different life than before. The change was in Alistair. The rigid control he had exerted over himself and his household had loosened. He began to take his meals with Eleanor and the children, both children. He would sit at the great dining table, not at the far end, but closer, close enough to hear Lily's bright chatter and to answer Thomas's serious, thoughtful questions. He was still quiet, still reserved, but the chilling coldness was gone, replaced by a watchful, gentle presence. He would listen as Eleanor spoke of her plans for the garden, his expression attentive, sometimes even offering a quiet suggestion. He started spending his afternoons not locked away in his study, but walking the grounds, often ending up at the walled garden, where he would watch the children play. One afternoon, Eleanor found him standing by the broken fountain. He was staring at the fallen cherub, its stone face covered in moss. "I have been a fool, Eleanor," he said, without turning to look at her. "A blind, selfish fool." "You were grieving," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "I was hiding," he corrected, his voice harsh with self-recrimination. "I hid in my grief. I used it as a shield, an excuse to lock myself away from the world, from my own child. I left her to be raised by governesses and housekeepers. I was so afraid of failing her as I had failed her mother. I did not even try to be a father." He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with a pain that was raw and real. "You You came into this house, this mausoleum, and you were not afraid. You reached out to her. You brought her back into the light. You and Thomas. You saved her. We saved each other, I think, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. We were all a bit lost in the dark. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray curl from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. "And you," he whispered, his gaze searching hers. "Who will save you from the terrible bargain you made with a broken man?" "Perhaps the man is not as broken as he thought," she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. A smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the last of the winter shadows. It was a hesitant, rusty thing, but it was real, and it was devastatingly beautiful. The moment was broken by the sound of the children's laughter as they chased a butterfly across the lawn. The spell was broken, but the magic lingered. Everything had changed. The nature of their relationship, the unspoken rules that had governed their lives, had been rewritten in the fire of Lily's fever. The contract was void. What was left in its place was fragile, unnamed, but pulsing with a terrifying and wonderful possibility. He started seeking her out. He would appear in the library in the evenings when she was reading, not speaking at first, just taking a chair by the fire, his presence a quiet comfort. Then he would read a passage aloud to her, his deep voice a resonant hum in the quiet room. He asked for her opinion on estate matters, not as a formality, as he had before, but with a genuine interest in her perspective. He started talking about his mother, the woman who had built the conservatory, sharing small memories, rebuilding the bridge to his own past. He was, she realized, courting her, not with flowers or poems, but with shared silence, with fragments of his history, with the breathtaking gift of his trust. He was slowly, carefully, inviting her into the locked rooms of his heart. And Eleanor, who had guarded her own heart for so long, found its walls crumbling. She had married him for security, for her son. She had stayed for his daughter, but now she stayed for him. She was falling in love with the man who was emerging from the ruins of the Winter Duke. The final wall came down on a bright, sunny afternoon a few weeks later. The garden was in full, riotous bloom, the air sweet with the scent of roses and honeysuckle. Eleanor was there, snipping roses for the house, the ones Alistair had bought, which were now covered in magnificent, fragrant blossoms. He came to her, walking down the gravel path, no longer a dark, imposing figure, but just a man. He was not wearing his formal coat, just a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked younger, more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his silver-grey eyes. He took the shears from her hand and set them in the basket with the flowers. "I need to say this," he began, his voice low and serious. "I have been trying to find the words, but they all seem inadequate." He took both of her hands in his. "I made a bargain with you, Eleanor, a cold, cruel, and selfish contract. I offered you a title and a fortune in exchange for your life, and I had the arrogance to believe it was a fair trade. I asked you to be a mother to my child because I was too much of a coward to be a father. I asked for a duchess, and instead, I was given a miracle." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but she did not look away. "You came into this empty house, and you filled it with life. You tended this neglected garden and made it bloom. You took my silent, heartbroken daughter and you taught her how to laugh again. You took me, he said, his voice breaking, a man who believed he was made of ice, and you made him feel the warmth of the sun for the first time in years. He raised one of her hands to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. The terms of our original agreement are null and void. I cannot offer you a life of separate wings and polite distance. It would be a torment. I cannot be in the same house with you and not seek you out. I cannot see you and not want to be near you. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I love you, Eleanor. I love your strength, your quiet courage, your compassion. I love the way you see the world, not as it is, but as it could be. You have brought the spring to Blackwood and to my heart. I am asking you, no, I am begging you, will you do me the honor of being my wife? In truth, in every way that matters, will you share your life with me, not as a duchess, but as my partner, my friend, my love? The tears she had been holding back now flowed freely down her cheeks. This was the dream she had not even dared to dream. This was the hope she had buried so long ago. Oh, Alistair, she whispered, her voice choked with a joy so profound it was painful. I thought you would never ask. She let out a small, watery laugh. I have loved you for some time now, you foolish, wonderful man. The relief and joy that flooded his face was a beautiful thing to behold. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. Eleanor, he breathed, as if her name were a prayer. And then, there in the sun-drenched, blooming garden that they had brought back to life together, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite duty or repressed passion. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was the tender, certain kiss of a man who had finally found his way out of the winter and into the arms of his spring. It was the beginning of everything. 1 year later, the walled garden at Blackwood Manor was the heart of the estate. The fountain had been repaired, the stone cherub now spouting a cheerful stream of water into a basin filled with lily pads. The paths were clear, the flower beds were a riot of carefully tended colour, and the conservatory glass gleamed in the sun. A large blanket was spread on the lush green lawn, upon which was laid the remnants of a picnic. Alistair lay propped on one elbow, a book forgotten in his hand, a look of serene contentment on his face. The harsh lines of grief and strain had been completely erased, replaced by the gentle creases of laughter. He was watching his family. Lily, now a bright, confident 6-year-old, was weaving a chain of daisies, her tongue sticking out in concentration. She was explaining, in great detail, the social hierarchy of the fairy kingdom to a patient and attentive Thomas. At 7, Thomas had assumed the role of older brother, with a gentle seriousness that was endearing. He had taken to Blackwood as if he were born to it, and he now called the man who was laughing at his sister's fairy tale pronouncements father. Eleanor sat beside Alistair, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. She was due in the autumn, and the prospect of a new baby had filled the house with a joyful anticipation. The manor was no longer a cold, silent place. It was a home filled with the noise and chaos and laughter of a happy family. Mrs. Gable now smiled, a shocking and yet welcome development. The portraits of the stern-faced ancestors seemed to look down with something approaching approval. "Do you remember the first day I came here?" Eleanor murmured, her fingers laced with Alistair's. I remember thinking you were too fragile for this place, he confessed, his voice a low rumble against her ear. I was a fool. You were the strongest person I had ever met. I was the fragile one. We mended each other, she said, turning her head to kiss his cheek. You mended me, he corrected softly. I just provided the garden. It was a very good garden, she laughed. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, they packed up their picnic. Thomas and Lily ran ahead, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Alistair stopped and pulled Eleanor into his arms, his hand resting protectively over hers on their unborn child. "Are you happy, my love?" he whispered, his lips against her hair. Eleanor leaned back, looking up at his face, at the love that shone so clearly in his eyes, the silver no longer wintry, but warm like summer moonlight. She looked at the house, its windows now glowing with welcoming golden light. She listened to the sound of her children's voices. Her heart was so full, she felt it might burst. "More than I ever thought possible," she said, and her voice was full of truth. The Winter Duke was a ghost, a story they would one day tell their children. The man who held her now was simply Alistair, her husband, her love, and together they had found their spring. Dear listener, isn't it a powerful thought that the coldest winters can give way to the most glorious spring? Eleanor's story reminds us of the quiet, persistent power of compassion. She walked into a world frozen by grief and fear, not with a grand plan, but with the simple, steady intention of tending to what was broken, of nurturing what was neglected. How often do we encounter our own walled gardens in life? Those people or situations that seem closed off, ruined, beyond repair. We see the overgrown weeds of anger, the broken stone of past hurts, the grimy glass of misunderstanding, and we are tempted to walk away. We see a Winter Duke, a person locked behind a fortress of their own pain, and we assume the coldness is all there is. But Eleanor teaches us a different way. She shows us that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures, but from the patient, daily work of pulling up one weed at a time, of letting in the light pain by pain, of speaking softly into the silence, not demanding a response, but simply offering the gift of a gentle presence. She understood that you cannot force a flower to bloom. You can only give it the sun, the water, and the space it needs to grow. Her story is a testament to the idea that true strength isn't about being impervious to pain, but about having the courage to remain open-hearted in a world that can often be cold. It's about seeing the potential for a garden in a patch of weeds, and seeing the capacity for love in a heart that has declared itself closed for business. So, the next time you encounter a person or a part of your own life that feels like a desolate winter, remember Eleanor. Remember the power of a kind word, a patient hand, a quiet act of care. You may not be able to command the seasons to change, but you can be the one who plants the first rose. You can be the one who lets in the sun. And you might just find that in healing the broken gardens of others, you are also miraculously tending to your own. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story has touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that spring is always possible. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to life. Until next time.